I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to learn about the power of envelope shaping. Now, if that sounds a little bit dry, don't go anywhere. It's not going to be, I promise. What I've got within this track so far is a 4-to-the-floor kick drum. Classic. Sounds like this. Yep. That's right. Okay, what I'm going to do is add a second track. And the track I'm going to add is for Retro Synth. I'm just going to drop down here, come and find Retro Synth. And what I'm going to do is to add a bass line. Now then, there are so many ways of creating bass lines in Logic, and we've looked at lots of them on this channel already. And what I'm going to do now is to show you another way. Now, I'm kind of thinking that what I want to do is to kind of make a bit of a techno start to this track. I've got my 4-to-the-floor kick drum, and what I want to do is to kind of write a really busy techno style bass line. And the thing about techno is that techno is really the sound of machines, and the thing about early machines is that they didn't really have access to velocity. They played back in time. In other words, what we effectively had was this real sense of something that didn't have any variation. It just provided a pattern. And of course, pattern sequencing is a great way of being able to produce bass lines like that. But you know what? I want to play this in and then fix it. I'm going to show you what I mean. Okay, I'm going to come and find a preset sound. Here is the synth bass sort of category, and I'm going to come down to this simple sawtooth bass sound. Now, the pattern that I want to play is a running series of 16th notes, and I'm a decent keyboard player, but I can't play a running series of 16th notes at 130 beats per minute. So what I'm going to do is to cheat. I'm going to come down to, let's say, 75 beats per minute. I'm going to think about my pattern, and then I'm going to record it. I'm only going to need a bar. And there is that bar. Now then, here's what I mean about sort of cheating. Well, firstly, it's obvious that I've cheated. I've taken the tempo down. So let's take it back up to 130. Now, because I want a kind of techno style bass line, the first thing I'm going to do is to quantize it, and that's going to sort out its timing. The next thing I'm going to do is to fix its dynamics, which is going to sort out any sense of velocity change. In other words, by fixing the dynamics, all of the notes that are being played within that sequence are now a velocity of 64. Okay, right in the middle of the velocity range. And if I want them all to be 84, let's say, or 94, I can add a velocity offset to those notes, which I'm going to do. So by adding 30, they're all now 94. And the other thing I want to do is to change their gate time so that they're all fixed as well. That means that all of those notes are now exactly the same length. How long are they? Incredibly short, as we're about to discover. Now, one really good thing about programming bass lines like this, if you want that kind of machine sound where everything is exactly the same, is that having made those changes, what I can do is to press Control and N, and what that does is to what's called normalize sequence parameters, which means it's just baked those changes into that region. If I open those up now, these notes up, they're all going to be the same color because they're all the same velocity, which I can see when I open up MIDI draw. The next thing is, if I really zoom in, I can see that they're all the same length and that length is really short. So if I want them longer, I can select them all, and what I can do is just simply drag out the length of them. So now they're all the same length as well. So we've effectively, by taking the tempo down to 80, played in the pattern that we want, and now we've normalized sequence parameters. And all I need to do now is to move it to the beginning and repeat it 3 times. And now I've got this bass line. If you've just joined the video now, I played that live, just like that, exactly like that, timing just like that, fixed, easy. It's just all in the hands practice. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do some interesting things with this bass line, and in particular what we're going to do is to explore the power of envelopes. Now, I've chosen Retro Synth because it allows us to see the 2 envelopes that exist within the synthesizer side by side, and what we're going to do is to focus on one and then the other. So what is an envelope? Okay, so synthesizers are sort of generally, or subtractive synthesizers tend to be broken down into 3 modules that you kind of need all of, which are the oscillator, the filter, and the amplifier. So in other words, the thing that's going to generate a waveform or a kind of core sound for you, the filter, which is going to control its tone, and then its amplifier, which is going to control its volume. And then we have some sections which we refer to as modulators. And what they do is to interrupt either the oscillator or the filter or the amplifier in interesting ways. So a low frequency oscillator, for instance, provides us with a waveform that we can sort of patch into another area of the synthesizer to produce change. If we wanted the tone to get brighter and duller, we could use an LFO, we could plug it into the filter section of the synthesizer, and that would begin to happen because the tone shaping part of the sound would open and close. Envelopes allow us to control things over time, and they generally offer us 4 separate controls, which are called attack, decay, sustain, and release. And what we're going to do in this video is to look at what happens when we apply envelope shaping to 2 key parts of the sound, namely the amplifier, which is going to control volume, and the filter, which is going to control tone. Okay, so down in the bottom right-hand corner, what we have at the moment is our amp envelope. In other words, the envelope that's going to affect the volume. Now, let's just listen to our bass line one more time so we're establishing exactly how it sounds. Okay, so this sound sounds the way that it does because of the combination of oscillators at the oscillator stage and the particular sort of position of the filter, but it also sounds the way that it does because of the way that the envelope is controlling that sound over time. I'm going to show you what I mean. So in the amplifier envelope section at the moment, I can see that the attack time, A, is currently set at 0.4 milliseconds. And the reason that we get this kind of spiky attack on the start of the note is because that's really short. In other words, the sound starts right away. If we had a longer attack time, effectively the sound would fade in a little bit. And for a sound that's moving this quickly, that wouldn't be ideal because we'd lose that definition at the start of the note. Then what we've got is what's called the decay phase. Now the decay controls how long it takes for the sound to drop away in volume to the sustain level. So effectively, what we've suddenly got now is this idea that there is a sort of level that the sound is going to reach where it's going to sustain. Now that tends to be much more obvious in sort of pad sounds where we hold sort of notes down for several seconds at once and their volume is kind of fixed. For a note that's happening this quickly, we're not really experiencing sustain in that way. But nevertheless, at the moment, the sustain level is set at maximum. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that down to 0. Now the sound isn't going to sustain at all. So what we've now got is immediate attack. We've got a decay time, which is currently set at 10 seconds, really long, much longer than any of these notes last. No sustain level, and then a release time. Now the release controls how long it takes for a sound to fade out when we let go of a note. And again, these notes are so quick that we're not really hearing that release time either at the moment. So let's actually start changing some of these parameters to begin to see what happens when we change the envelope. So I'm going to keep the attack time the same because it's the only bit of this envelope that currently really makes sense, i.e. we want that attack. What I'm going to do is to drop the decay time massively. So it goes from being 10 seconds long to, let's say, something more like 400 milliseconds long. And we're going to adjust that again in a minute. So remember, now the sound's going to speak. It's going to sort of make a noise. It's then going to drop away in just under half a second, which is still going to be too long, I think. The sustain level is 0, which means the sound is basically sustaining away to nothing. And then we get a little bit of release. When the note lets go, it lasts for a little bit longer. Okay, now what I'm going to do is to experiment with a couple of these parameters in real time. And there's my new bass sound, just like a bass. Okay, now why have we only got this really snappy, kind of clicky sound? Well, let's think about it for a moment. This envelope is controlling the volume of the sound. The sound now speaks, each note speaks, I'm going to use that word, in 0.1 milliseconds. So basically immediately. Then what happens is it dies away in 0.39 milliseconds. So long before we get any chance to kind of feel like we've heard that note, the kind of baseline note that we were listening to before, it never really gets a chance to get going before we're effectively telling the envelope to shut the note down. There is no sustain level, so the sound doesn't get a chance to sustain for any length of time at all. And I've turned the release time down as well, which means if that note was going to try and establish itself, it doesn't get a chance to before the next one starts. And now, even though I haven't touched the oscillator or the filter or the amplifier settings up at the top of the interface, the amp envelope is now massively impacting the way that this sound behaves. Okay, now you might already be thinking, I'd quite like to automate that parameter. And you'd be right, that would be a good one to automate. Suddenly we have a chance to sort of bring our baseline in from this unbelievably percussive start. Okay, so what would it sound like if I kept decay short but increased the release time? In other words, effectively the note has a chance to establish itself after it's been let go of, if you like. Well, again, let's just solo this sound so we're hearing it by itself. Now, what's interesting about that effect is it almost sounds like reverb. We get this same spiky sort of effect at the beginning of the note, but what we now get is the note lasting every time it's released for, I don't know, I think I had it around the sort of half-second mark a moment ago. So in other words, what we almost get is this kind of half-second, almost reverb-like quality. Now, it's not reverb, it's just effectively the legacy of the way that the envelope is behaving at the volume stage. So hopefully that makes sense. What we've effectively got is our 4 parameters allowing us to control the way that volume behaves. Okay, now then, we've also got a completely separate envelope for the filter stage. This is going to control tone. Now, in order for us to really hear the way that this is going to behave, I need to change a couple of things at the amplifier stage. I need this note to last for a little while so we can hear what the tone changes are going to be. So for a moment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the sustain level up to around, I don't know, yeah, somewhere near the top. So effectively the sound is going to last for a little bit longer. I'm going to increase the decay time as well, bring release down a little bit, but effectively now we've got this sound. So I haven't changed the filter envelope yet, I've just changed the amp envelope. And now we're back to something nearer where we were. Okay, now then, how do I feed the filter envelope, which has got the same controls, attack, decay, sustain, and release, into the filter section of the synthesizer? And in fact, what's it already doing? Well, the envelope control is here. This dial here tells the filter how much of the envelope is going to control the way that it behaves. So if I turn the envelope down to 0, there is no filter envelope on this sound. And by the way, that sounds like this. And now I'm introducing it and we begin to get this definition. So what exactly is happening to the sound as I introduce more envelope? Well, effectively what's happening is this shape, which we can see very clearly from the way that it's being sort of demonstrated through the 4 separate points, is affecting what's called the cutoff frequency of the filter. This basically, the cutoff frequency is the point that basically controls how much brightness we're going to get in the sound. Now, I don't want to get into a full definition of synthesis here, but if you imagine that the core sound that we're playing with here has low frequencies, mid-range frequencies, and some bright frequencies too, then effectively we've got this kind of slab of frequency content. And what the filter is doing is basically saying, okay, how many of those frequencies do we want to hear at the same time? Do we want a big, rich, open sound, or do we want something which is much more muted? In other words, a lot of the upper frequency content has been filtered, literally filtered out. Okay, so what happens when we open up the envelope is that we're effectively saying we want this shape here to control how that shape behaves at the tone stage. In other words, if we want a spike of bright frequencies at the beginning of the note, and then we want it to recover to something duller, then we want an immediate attack, we want it to fall away quite quickly from a decay point of view, we want no sustain, and we're not too worried about the release in terms of the way that this is going to behave. In other words, we get the kind of beginning spike of the note, and then effectively the sound becomes dull. And what we can see when we turn the envelope off altogether is that we don't have any of that shape control. In other words, the sound is just being filtered. And as we introduce it, we begin to get that spike. Now you might be thinking, okay, well I don't want the spike, but I do want the sound to be brighter. How do I control that? Well, that would just involve me turning up the cutoff frequency. So now there's no envelope shaping, but the sound will be brighter. But it doesn't have quite the same definition as taking the cutoff frequency down and turning the envelope shaping up. Okay, so what happens when I start experimenting with different envelope shaping parameters for the filter? Well, I'll just press play and start making some changes. Okay, so that's all fun. And then what we're going to do is to do exactly the same thing again, but this time with both the filter and the amp. Now remember, this is controlling volume and this is controlling brightness. Do that all day. Okay, so you can see that the amount of opportunity here to shape how sounds behave is enormous. Envelopes are incredibly powerful. And remember, all of this has got nothing to do with us changing the core values of this sound, if you like. In other words, I haven't touched any of the settings for the way that this sound is sort of sculpted at the oscillator stage. And really, apart from the envelope amount, I'm not really touching the filter settings either. And you can just begin to see that all of the changes that we're playing with just have to do with how time affects the volume and the filter stages. So hopefully this has shone a little bit of a light of the way that envelopes work. And it's also maybe provided some insight into how, progressive house records in particular get shaped. You can have just two sounds, a kick drum and a bass line, and provided you are ready to sort of automate parameters and bring things in at different speeds and basically have sounds evolve in different ways, just the amplifier settings can provide an enormous array of kind of evolving tones for your tracks.